Um, yeah, hi everyone. So I'm dialing in from Chicago right now, 5:30 a.m. Very happy to get up, get up this early and do a lecture. I mean, I actually think that it's a little better, a little nicer than doing it in the evening when it's sometimes I get sleepy and it's time to go to bed after that. Yeah, this is a good start to the day. Um, Thank you for inviting me. So I am the author of a new book from Penguin Random House. It's called Samsung Rising, the inside story of the South Korean giant that set out to beat Apple and conquer tech. It's out from Penguin Random House, published about a month ago, published at the height of the coronavirus, which I think you would assume would, make the book, there would be less interest in it, but it's actually had the opposite effect because now people need something to read. So we've actually gotten a little boost in the sales and all that. Um, so, um, Here's the book, and it's based on about a decade of research and reporting in Korea and
Minus
Huh?
Zoom lecture.
Oh, cool.
Oh, is every microphone muted? Sorry, I think there's some interference in the background.
Oh, sorry, it said it was muted.
Oh yeah, sure, no problem, Andre. Cool. So I'm just going to start by telling you a story about how I, first got interested in this topic and why I decided to write a book about Samsung. Of all topics you could write about in Korea. So I was originally a journalist. I was covering technology, business, politics. I was covering Google for a while. I had covered, various technology companies in America and around the world. I was based in Vietnam, Cambodia. I was in China for a little while. I'm now actually based in Turkey, in Istanbul, writing about the Middle East. But back in 2009 and 2010, I was reporting on the Apple versus Samsung technology battles. This was back when Apple had first released its, a couple of years after Apple had released the iPhone, and Samsung had just come out with its counterattack, which was the first Samsung Galaxy, which was a rather obscure phone that wasn't really being used widely outside of Korea. I mean, it was kind of considered as the cheap, the cheap knockoff that nobody really cared about. And so, I got a call from my editor. This was at the Fast Company magazine, which is a technology magazine based in New York, tech and business. And they told me that they had gotten an invitation from this company called Samsung, and that they wanted us to do a couple of tours of their Seoul offices, Suwon, about an hour south of Seoul, and their New York offices to meet some of the executives, to get to know them, to possibly write a story on them, a cover story in the magazine about this giant Korean technology conglomerate that nobody outside Korea seemed to really know that well, but that had managed to suddenly come out of nowhere with this giant smartphone onslaught against Apple that was really the only company in the world that was willing to go up against Apple, which was considered the gold standard at the time. So I thought about it. I had actually already been in Korea for a year. I was already based in Korea. I had been flying back and forth to Cupertino, California. I was at the Apple versus Samsung trial, and writing and talking to Apple executives. And of course, the Apple executives would all just kind of smash Samsung and blow them off and say, look, this company, they're a knockoff maker, they're cheap, they're an imitator. But I felt that this was a really good opportunity to get inside this tech giant that nobody really knew, and to try to get to understand them more. I mean, I saw their name everywhere. I knew their basic history in Korea. I had been studying Korean at that point, and had been, reading, online Korean posts about, what was happening with this company. But it was almost as if there was really this black hole, and, somebody needed to really get in there and just try to write this story about this major company. So we did the tour. It was me. I was with another journalist from the magazine. We interviewed about 24 executives, mostly at the executive vice president level. Saw some very fascinating concepts being developed. This was when they were first developing the foldable smartphone that's now out today. I mean, it was truly an interesting talk. But as I got deeper and deeper into these tours and deeper into these interviews, I found this really unusual, this tick, this thing that they would do. We'd be talking about technology, we'd be talking about semiconductors, and then suddenly a Samsung executive would go into a North Korea mode and start saying about how great the chairman is, and they'd say that we're implementing the chairman's vision, and that the chairman is a glorious leader, and he created a miracle, and we're here, the Samsung executives, our job is to implement the vision of our great leader who has brought down his wisdom upon us. And they go into these stories and stories and stories about the chairman and how he gave 300 hours of speeches and how he stayed awake all night and how he protects his people and protects his country. And I thought, like, okay, that's kind of interesting. And then, I would go to the next interview and, we talk about, a smartphone display or some, a smartphone design. And I'd say, so how did you, how did you get that design? I mean, how did you come to that idea? And the smartphone designer would respond, well, our chairman, he wanted to create a miracle. He wanted to create a miracle for our society. So we decided to create this smartphone to create that miracle for him. We're trying to execute the vision of our chairman. And everywhere I went, people would talk about this chairman who was like this god within the company. And, this was Lee Byung-chul, who is, well known in Korea. I'm sure many of you are well aware of his presence and, what he's done for Korea. But everywhere I went, each office, I would ask questions and they would respond with grand stories about the chairman and his dictates and his speeches and the vision that he laid down. And I was thinking, like, okay, that's kind of interesting. So I filed the report. We went back to the magazine. I told my editors about this kind of, funny quirk that these Samsung executives had. And, we went with the story. And then a couple years later, I did my, just to back up a little bit, I had also done some of my own research. And, I would talk to employees and they would show me videos of of an event called the Samsung Summer Festival, which was essentially a mass games event for Samsung employees. And, I'm just sitting there watching this and, I showed it to some Korea-focused academics to try to get a sense of what's going on here. And, they would use slogans like "Songni," victory. And, they would make so this was all these recruits who would get information and they would on a football field, and they'd hold up placards and, they would make like an image of the word victory in Korean, and then they would make an image of like a punching fist, and then they would make an image of a Pegasus, a Tolima, as they would call it. They would make an image of a smartphone, and then they would make an image of the sales figures, and then they would make an image of the Samsung logo, and then, finally the event would end. And so as I got deeper and deeper into this company, I started thinking, like, okay, there's something really unusual going on here that it doesn't quite exist in the Silicon Valley firms or the Chinese firms or the Vietnamese firms or the Japanese firms that I've covered. I mean, I've written about Saudi, but I've never really seen such a militaristic spirit and a nationalistic spirit wrapped up inside a single company. So a couple of years later, I made my first visit to North Korea, got to know my guide, Mr. Han, who showed me around the country, and saw the Arirang mass games, did the usual thing. And I sat there thinking, like, okay, the things that my North Korean guide is saying to me are very similar to the things that that Samsung executives would tell me. I mean, certainly not on such an extreme scale, but it rung very similar. And the kinds of mass games they would hold and the kinds of propaganda slogans. I remember I was looking at a Samsung video and they had a slogan, and it was "We who have become one." So I decided that there was something going on here, some kind of pan-Korean national identity that clearly transcends the modern border we have. And Samsung does have roots in the Japanese imperial era. And as I looked deeper and deeper into Samsung, going back into the history, I had read a series of books on Korea that really influenced me. One of them was the Politics of the Vortex by Gregory Henderson, who I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. Another one was the work of B.R. Myers. And then the last one was Carter Eckert, who had written a biography recently on Park Chung-hee. And as I went through some of the academic literature and then kind of gathered my own experience, I thought somebody really needs to write a book about this technology giant that is just so incredibly wrapped up in the fate of an entire nation, that is so military bound and so military like in its ways, that it has really upended the technology world in ways that a lot of people can't see. I mean, Samsung is a company that makes all the semiconductors, that are in the iPhone, for example. They make the displays. They make just, they do, they run a theme park. They run hospitals. You can live your life cradle to the grave on Samsung. And, you can even be a Samsung executive. You can be a Samsung man, as they call them, and just bring pride on your family and country. So, so after, doing my journalism and some of my reporting on Samsung, I decided to set out in about 2014 to write a book, that would tell the story of this company, and not only the company itself, but the culture that it has created, the corporate culture, and the unusual ways, in which it's actually in many ways created the nation of South Korea, from at least the 1980s, maybe even going back to the 1960s. So this was, I set out, I was living in Seoul at the time. I would travel around, go to the Suwon area, talk to Samsung employees out of their campus there. I set out and I basically cast a wide net and I was relentlessly digging. I would go in, find whatever I could, talk to as many people as I can unofficially. I approached Samsung. They actually declined to cooperate. They didn't think a book would be good for them at the time. And I kept finding the same effect over and over, that there was this embedded nationalism in the Samsung tradition that was just so unusual for a company. So finally, I was actually having a lot of trouble writing this book. And finally, I got to a point where I got my first introduction to the founding Lee family of Samsung. Certainly not easy. It took many years of work, a lot of years of, networking with people and drinking lots of, somek and all this stuff. I mean, I think that my alcohol tolerance probably rose a good level, dining with Samsung executives. And I finally got access to the family, and I sat down with him. His name was Henry Cho. He was on the Cho Dong-hyuk, on the Hansol side of the family. And I sat down with him, and the first thing he said to me is, first you need to learn the Crest of Honor if you want to understand Samsung. And the Crest of Honor, so the family Crest of Honor, I guess in Korean you would call it a kahun. And I'm just thinking, this is so Samsung that, this is, I'm sitting down with a family member and they're telling me that there's a Crest of Honor that all their employees must memorize and must look after. And that Crest of Honor was three stages. It was the pursuit of the rational, the pursuit of reason, a belief in humanity, a belief in human resources and hiring talent. And then the last part was the last part escapes me now, but it's quite early here. It's still 5:45 a.m. This was, I think, the turning point when I was writing this book. When I finally had access to the inside, I talked to the Hansol side of the family, which was run by Lee In-hee, who's the oldest sister of the Lee family, the second generation. So they have quite a lot of historical archives and knowledge. And then I was able to get to a number of other Samsung Lee family members who were not included in the book because they didn't want any mention of their involvement. They would only speak on background and only off the record. I couldn't use their names, but I could vaguely cite their material without citing them. And that really became the turning point when I realized, how deep I was going into this rabbit hole and how, just how vexed and how complicated and, even how dark the history of Samsung and the history of South Korea has been during this Park Chung-hee era in Chun Doo-hwan. Today, I'm just gonna, you know, getting into that rabbit hole that I had gone into that I found so fascinating. I'm gonna tell the story of this family, in the three generations of the Lee dynasty, the three generations, of a dynasty that, not only set out to build a company, but build a nation and to install their heirs in ways that were truly like some kind of K-drama or soap opera, or I don't know if you've seen HBO's Succession. It's very similar to that. It's a fascinating company because it is a technology firm that's layered with a royal family, royalty essentially, that acts in ways that you would expect, out of a feudal kingdom somewhere, and not so much a modern, Apple-like, Google-like firm, despite them wanting to be that. Um, so, the story of Lee Byung-chul, he's the founder of Samsung, and excuse me, I need some coffee. So Lee Byung-chul started Samsung in 1938 after a failed rice trading venture. There was a credit crunch in the Japanese empire. A lot of credit from state-influenced banks had to go to the Japanese war effort, and so his first rice trading venture failed. He lost a lot of the money from his relatively wealthy landowning family, and he came from the southeast of Korea. But in 1938, he decided to try to make his rebound. He had spent a year traveling around what is today China, back then Manchuria, traveling around the Japanese empire, sort of the early Japanese empire, looking for gaps in the market, looking for things that civilians and soldiers needed. And he found one big gap in the market, and it was the need for just fresh produce, vegetables. There were food shortages at the time. A lot of the food supplies for the Japanese military and Japanese civilians was really up in the air. It was a very unstable time with price fluctuations. And he decided to open basically a small trading company in a grocery store called Samsung Songhui, which roughly means the 3 stars shop. He chose the name Samsung because he was looking to and admiring these Japanese conglomerates that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, called the Zaibatsu. The Zaibatsu roughly translates to wealth clan, and he had been looking to Mitsubishi. Mitsubishi was one of the big four Zaibatsu of the time, a driver of the Japanese war effort. And while he didn't, he didn't admire the Japanese colonial project over Korea by any means, he wasn't a collaborator, I would say. He admired the longevity and the success of these companies in building Japan into this industrial power. I mean, essentially building Japan, starting with the Meiji era, from something that was, more like a warlord kingdom to an actual respectable global power that could stand on its own and that could resist colonization from outside powers. Japan was standing tall and standing fine back then. And so he chose the name Samsung. So Mitsubishi, there are a couple translations, and maybe a Japanese speaker can give a better translation, but I'll use the translation 3 diamonds. I've also heard there's one that's like, 3 water lilies or something, but I don't remember exactly what that translation was. And he chose Samsung, which means 3 stars. He said that it was because, the number 3 was considered lucky, but also stars are symbols of longevity, that he wanted Samsung to be eternal. He borrowed a line from Mitsubishi and the other Japanese Zaibatsu, and when he said that he wanted Samsung to last 300 years. That was a similar edict to what the Zaibatsu leaders told their employees, that we want Mitsubishi, we want Mitsui to last 300 years. We want these to be eternal companies. I think he really respected the Japanese tradition of longevity across many generations of a family, and he wanted that to be like at Samsung too. And I'm sure some of the people who've lived in Japan know about some of these Japanese companies that claim to have 1,000 years of history behind them, that they've had one family running the company for 400 years, and all these kinds of things. I mean, that's one of the things that I find really interesting about Japanese corporate culture. So Lee Byung-chul started in 1938, starts this grocery store. Um, a lot of his genius comes from his political abilities, his ability to form political connections with whoever's in power, devoid of any kind of really, I think ideology, or devoid of any, I hate to say it, but sense of ethical obligation. It's really about finding the people in power, whether they're Japanese colonialists or the American military government after 1945. And just finding people who can give him licenses that will allow him to expand his businesses. After founding his grocery store, he quickly expanded into beer brewing, which was a highly profitable business at the time. And there were only a couple licenses that were given to firms in Korea making beer. It was called the Chosun Brewery. And the other firms were Japanese firms. It was very rare for a Korean firm to be able to enter this business. He kept expanding. The beer brewery raised his profits quite a bit. But then, of course, as you all know, the war ended in 1945, and the American soldiers arrived to enforce the surrender of the emperor. They arrived at the Korean Peninsula a couple weeks, I believe, after the surrender of Japan, and they set up the American military government to enforce this new order on the Korean Peninsula. Lee Byung-chul set up I guess you could call it a learned society, and he would select. He had a process of being very selective, and he would find just the right people to put in it. This was in his home base at the time of Daegu, and he would meet with. They would mostly be Korean managers for the American military, and he'd meet them, and he'd build his connections. And then, after the American military government left, the Korean War hit, and there was devastation. His business was almost destroyed. He actually fled down to Busan. But for all the survivors of this war, one of the effects that happened is that when Lee Suk-mun, the first Korean president, became president, a lot of the elites, the American military managers and sort of the Korean elites who are working with the American military went back to Seoul, and he had moved to Seoul at this time because he wanted to test his fortunes. And he had essentially created an old boys network of political power that reached into the first Lee Suk-mun government. He befriended a man named Hong Jin-ki, who comes from the Hong family that runs the Jungang today, the newspaper. And he used this connection. So Hong Jin-ki was a justice official in the Lee Suk-mun government, and he essentially served as you could say, the political power base for this Samsung empire. And it was through building this network that he was able to get more and more licenses that allowed him to get foreign currency, especially U.S. dollars, were highly valued at the time. Korea was essentially destroyed. It was rubble after the Korean War, and he got these licenses to not only expand but to use foreign currency in his reserves, highly valuable, and he could use this foreign currency to essentially bribe his way into getting more licenses that would allow him to practice what was called import substitution, which was the practice of importing raw materials, so say wool or unrefined sugar, and the timber that would be used to make paper, and then refining these materials into end products that could be exported. That was the early source of his wealth. And by the late 1950s, he had actually become the richest man in Korea, and also a symbol of its corruption. I mean, he was seen as this tycoon who had a dark streak, this tycoon who would bully his critics. So when I met Henry Cho, who was his grandson, and now an honorary chairman of Hansol, he began telling me about Lee Byung-chul's personality and how he created this Samsung empire, how he created this company that really came to define a good deal of Korean economic culture. He said that Lee Byung-chul was extremely detail-oriented, that he was extremely interested in saving resources and saving and reducing waste at a time when natural resources simply didn't really exist in Korea. He would tear his napkin in half, for example. He'd save the other half for later. That's how finicky he was about what exactly he was doing. And it was through this mixture of these political connections and an ability to just to slim down resources wherever you can, just to go cheap, to purchase distressed companies at super low prices, and just to reinvigorate them, just finding ways to keep prices as low as he could. That really led to his early success. But this success did not last very long. I'm sure a lot of you know, in 1961, a general named Park Chung-hee launched a coup d'etat, overthrew the government, the young democracy of Korea, assumed power, became the head of the National Reconstruction Council. He was essentially the new dictator of Korea. And he had Lee Byung-chul and he had Samsung in his crosshairs. So Park Chung-hee was a former a military officer who had been trained by Japan, had spent time in Manchuria, which was the center of the Japanese war effort. And one of the things that Park Chung-hee observed during his time there was both an admiration for the potential of industry to build a nation, but a kind of resentfulness over I guess you could say the excesses of these industrial conglomerates back in Japan, that that they had done a lot to build Japan, but also they had done a lot to stunt Japan by getting too powerful, getting too wealthy, putting politicians into office, just simply damaging the Japanese national project. So Park Chung-hee looked at Samsung and he saw these people as essentially aristocrats, as people who were not working for the national project, who were corrupt and decadent, and they were going to ruin Korea as a nation. He did not like Samsung, and so he made a deal with Lee Byung-chul, and he said, look, you're going to be a part of this new nation building project that I'm doing, and in exchange, you're going to have to pay you're going to have to pay tax evasion, your back taxes. You're going to have to pay a few million US$ in back taxes. And in exchange, you won't go to jail right now. A lot of Lee Byung-chul's colleagues did go to jail. Many Samsung executives back then did actually end up in prison. They were seen by the government as white-collar criminals, and they were seen as people who couldn't really be trusted by the government. So Lee Byung-chul reluctantly goes along with this. And by the way, I wish I had PowerPoint slides. It's kind of hard to do PowerPoint on this thing, so I'm just going by memory right now. But anyway, so at this moment when the new government takes power, it really changes, I think, the role that these chaebol groups play in Korea. And the role, so when I say the role, I'm talking about a pattern. And it's a pattern that we see in Korea that continues today. It's a pattern of publicly chastising and shaming and arresting and going after supposedly corrupt executives who've done some very shady things that hurt the national interest. And then after they get hit with the big stick a few times, they get a prison sentence, or they get whatever, they get commuted prison sentences, as common in Korea. Then things go back to normal. They're allowed to go back to their business. They've been made an example of. Everybody gets to look good. The government looks good for giving them a sentence. The courts look like they're doing their job. The chaebol groups look like they learned their lesson and they're going to go back to contributing to the nation. And this is really the moment. It's the Park Chung-hee government that creates this very unusual pattern in Korea that I haven't found anywhere else. And I've looked all over the world for something like this pattern of having a major conglomerate that's constantly having leaders in and out of prison or in and out of suspended sentences, and then going back to running their companies, which is truly strange, truly bizarre. It's just, it doesn't exist anywhere else. I mean, the closest might be Israel, but Israel still has its own system of family governments. So anyway, so moving on. So Lee Byung-chul is about to elect his first son to be the next chairman of Samsung. His first son, his name is Lee Myung-hee, and he's a man who has a meticulous method to him. He's not seen by his father as somebody who's necessarily a good businessman. He's a bit into the details, has a bit of a temper, does a few things that that put off his father. He appoints him as this leader. So long story short, I won't get into the details, but there was a major scandal in the 1960s, and it was over the sale of sorry, it's a little early here. It's like 6 a.m. It's the sale of etza, which is a chemical that's used in fertilizer. And this gets to the black market, and it's sold at a higher profit on the black market, benefiting Samsung. So Lee Byung-chul's second son is sent to jail for this. He's sent to a 5-year prison sentence. And Lee Byung-chul steps down and gives the company to his first son, Lee Myung-hee. But Lee Myung-hee is somebody who just has this insanely just grating way of managing people. He made some top executives come into his office, and he admitted this, made them kneel down before him and swear allegiance to him. There were some very strange episodes later where he had, been exiled to this fishing village by his angry father. And, he was convinced that Samsung executives were plotting to kidnap him at one point. And, he claimed that one time he had, his Samsung executives had showed up to see him, and so he fired a rifle into the air, into the ceiling, and scared them off. He claimed that, he had a lot of these really funny stories that I don't know much about the veracity of them. But looking into him and talking to family members, he's certainly somebody who was not fit to lead a major company like this. So because of all this drama, Lee Byung-chul comes back to the company, 1968, reinstates himself, and then later says that his youngest son, Lee, who is the current chairman of Samsung, is going to become the leader. And this sparks a major inheritance feud, an inheritance feud that actually has continued until quite recently. And as I went through this story, as I researched this, I couldn't help but think about just the dynastic nature of this firm, and how it has this family that's been through a number of just constant infighting and constant drama. And there was a case back in the 90s where the Samsung chairman had put cameras on his house, and it was looking at a rival family member's house. I've heard stories. This is all in the book, by the way. Stories of purges and stories of efforts to push out rival family members and to take their take what they own, to take their business units, to take their wealth. It truly is a Machiavellian system. And speaking to even Samsung executives today, they look back on this history and they say that yes, Samsung, it mimics the old ways. It's something that you'd see in the Yi dynasty of Korea or in the Japanese Zaibatsu of the day. You see similar stories in the North Korean Kim dynasty. You see similar stories in Southern European, particularly feudal lords and tribal warfare going on down there. But it's not something that you see very often in a global technology giant. It's truly unusual. So this new chairman, so Samsung chairman Lee, he's rising to this level of vice chairman. He's an untested leader, and his father has an idea to enter the semiconductors market. And semiconductors at the time, so this is in the 1970s, and there are two countries that dominate the world of chipsets, which are Japan and America, and they're generations ahead of Korea. But there was a California entrepreneur. His name was Joseph Sudduth, and this is one of the stories that I think got lost in the official histories of Samsung in Korea. But he opened up a joint venture with a Korean partner named Kim Ki-nam, and they decided that they were going to see if they could assemble semiconductors in Korea and then export them to some of the early calculators and the PCs that were being built at the time, some of the early IBM PCs, to see if Korea actually had promise. So there were big economic changes happening in Korea at the time and around the world. There was the oil embargo, so energy prices were spiking. There were oil shortages, and it became clear that the way forward was for Korea eventually was to rely on value-added industries that were not so energy intensive. So heavy industries, for example, that's called black growth, and it means that they heavily rely on oil and all these natural resources that simply are not available at the time. But semiconductors rely more on human talent, human abilities. You need to hire good engineers, hire good people, and so this joint venture gets a loan from the U.S. State Department, and the idea is to help Korea build its economy. But then very quickly, this company is in the red because I think the two founders didn't realize just how complicated and how long-term the investments would be in semiconductors. I mean, to make a semiconductor, it requires years and years and years of work and years of planning, and then there might be a fluctuation in the market. I mean, prices might suddenly fall or the supply might rise suddenly, and then suddenly you just don't have a profit at all. You might be making a loss. So they wanted to get out of the business, and so the two Samsung partners in this case ultimately became the founder Lee Byung-chul and Lee. They came in, they saw this this business that was having trouble, and they decided to buy it at a low price and do the Samsung thing, which was to repair it, build it into a long-term sustainable business, and then set off from there. The philosophical thinking was something that we see in a lot of East Asian companies behind this, East Asian technology giants. The Samsung executives decided that, so they were trying to make TVs and microwaves at the time, but they were thinking, making these electronics without having the semiconductors, it's like trying to make a car, but you can't make an engine. It's just, it's impossible, and it's a position you don't want to be in. And especially with some of the things that Japan was doing at the time, Japan was flooding the market with semiconductors and trying to put Korean firms out of business. They decided that they had to secure their own. Samsung and Korea had to secure its own supply of semiconductors, which would ultimately be the base of its growth for the years to come. So in the 1980s, this is when the current Samsung chairman, Lee, who's an untested playboy, likes driving fast cars, likes pretty women, was caught on a video with 4 prostitutes at one point. Also has a prescription drug addiction. At one point, he got in a car crash and got hooked on a drug called Demerol, which is an opioid, a painkiller, a powerful painkiller. This is his chance where he comes out and he's going to pass his father's test, and he says, we're going to make Samsung a major electronics manufacturer, not just this crappy trading company that nobody cares about in this dusty, poor country called Korea. We actually want to be a global firm, and semiconductors are the way to do it. So Samsung initiates, in one of its highly militaristic, ritualized traditions, tells its engineers that they're going to go on a 64-kilometer hike through the mountains through the day and night. This is down in I forgot. It's not Suwon. It's I forgot the town right now, and I apologize for that. But it's a 64-kilometer hike. They're going to go all night long, and they're going to be ambushed with all these games, and they're going to have to think on the spot. And the purpose of this is both to forge unity, a team spirit, and as they told them, to strengthen our minjok, to strengthen our Korean race, our Korean ethnicity. They're told that they must do this to suffer to succeed, and if they cannot suffer in the years ahead, then they are not true Samsung men. So the Samsung engineers go on this night hike. They're marching in unison. A lot of them are former infantrymen, and then finally they get there. They get to the newly christened Samsung plant the next morning. They enter it. It's 7 a.m. They sign a pledge, and they say, I promise that I will make Samsung great, that I will make Korea great, that I will make our nation great, and our minjok, our Korean ethnicity, our Korean race great for the world. They go to work, they put on their uniforms for the semiconductor things, they sing the company song, they stand before the chairman, they salute him, and they say, we are now going to begin our project to defeat Japan. And by the way, Japan, as you know, is the enemy. Japan is the enemy for Samsung and for Korea. So the 1980s, 1990s, 1980s are crazy years where Samsung is just going at it. They have pretty much no know-how in how to make a semiconductor, which is extremely complicated. But they managed to make it through just good old hustling. They go to Japan. They bring back. So Chairman Lee would bring back Japanese engineers on the weekends. He'd pay them to moonlight, give them the IP, they'd give the IP, they'd give the intellectual property. It was a total, it was essentially a success that was based on the looting of Japanese technologies and Japanese intellectual property, along with Micron, which was an American firm. They formed a partnership with Micron and went into its offices, which I believe are somewhere in the American West. It was a struggling semiconductor maker, and the Samsung executives and engineers went in. They weren't allowed to touch computers. They weren't allowed to, do anything that would anger the hosts. But they would try to memorize the charts that were around the room, the semiconductor charts, which are very complicated. And then they would go back to the hotel that night and try to piece them together by memory to try to figure out how Micron would make its semiconductors. So this is really just, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way, but it really is the wholesale looting of Japanese and American technologies and just trying to steal whatever is possible and learn how to make them, and then using that to make Samsung a company that could stand on its own. Lots of hard work went into this. I mean, lots of people. I've interviewed lots of engineers who worked on this grand project, and they just talk about the insane hours, 15, 20 hours a day, barely any time to sleep. They'd be in the office until 11 p.m. They'd have to, there would be a problem with the semiconductor on the factory line, and that would mean that since they don't have a manual, they don't know, what the problem is. They would have to go back through the entire assembly line and reverse engineer each part. So they'd have to go back and relearn how to make a semiconductor because they just didn't really know what they were doing. But finally, after the Japanese firms flooded the market and tried to put Samsung out of business, the Japanese firms decided that there was going to be a shakeout, and that it was time to get out of these DRAM semiconductors. This was in the early 90s, and so Samsung by the late 80s and early 90s had emerged victorious. I mean, they had successfully chased Japan, caught up to Japan, defeated Japan, and also America too. But Japan was really the main target. It was Hitachi. It was later it would be Sony. It was also a few others, like a few other companies. But so this is really the moment that Samsung emerges as a global firm, and really the only firm globally aside from Hyundai that is a symbol of the Korean nation building project. Samsung also can stand on its own. It no longer really needs government support. But then as this is all happening, the Samsung chairman, Lee Kun-hee, who's a bit of a recluse, a bit of an eccentric, who has his prescription drug habit and likes watching lots of movies in his room alone. I mean, he has all these tapes littered in his living room, and he watches classic films all day, like Ben-Hur. He studies the world. He studies what's going on. He starts to come to this realization that what Samsung has done with semiconductors is not going to last forever, because a semiconductor this year is obsolete in 6 months. I mean, you really only have a small amount of time to make it something big. And how long is it going to be before a Chinese firm catches up, or a Taiwanese firm? I mean, how long is it going to be before Samsung loses its place, just as Japan had lost its place before? That's his line of thinking. He sees what's going on in the world at this time. The Cold War is ending. The world is changing. There are free trade agreements. There's NAFTA. Later on, there are going to be free trade. There's the World Trade Organization is opening the world. And he sees that, this is going to happen to Korea too. Like, Korea is actually going to get squashed, because his thinking is that we are surrounded by major foreign powers, and they've meddled in Korea for a long time. It's, the China, Russia, Japan, America. This is his line of thinking, and this is in the internal Samsung documents that I found, that if Samsung is not strong and a nation's technology is not strong for the post-Cold War era to come, then Korea will not be strong, and Korea will simply be crushed under the weight of Motorola and Apple and IBM and Sony and these other giants at the time. So the Samsung chairman, instigates this campaign of rejuvenation among employees. He tells them, that we can't rely on past successes forever. And, it's easy to look back in hindsight and say, like, duh, of course. I mean, you can't just keep doing the same thing over and over. But this is actually something that I really admire about Samsung, and something that I really enjoyed, writing the book, like an element of the book I enjoyed writing, because, it's not always that simple when you're actually in the company and the day-to-day work. And if you look at the history of any major company, they hit their zenith. They hit their height, and they tend to think that past successes will be profitable for a long time, and that as long as you keep doing what you've been doing, And as long as you don't take that major risk to invest in new areas, which are going to lead to losses for a long time, then yeah, I mean, you'll be fine in your career. You can retire with a solid income, a solid paycheck, take care of your family. But I think that Lee Kun-hee was a little different because he was an heir who had the world given to him, who had all the wealth and the riches in the world given to him. He was Korea's richest man, and he could have sat on semiconductors for a long time and retired and been happy with that. But instead, he decided that at the height of Samsung's success in the 90s, Samsung had to change everything, and he went on a series of speeches. He went to Frankfurt, which was a symbol of the German reconstruction effort after World War II, and told his employees that you need to change everything except your wife and children. He gave about 350 hours of speeches and just yelled at them and chided them and swore at them and told them that they're being complacent and they're relying on past successes, and now is the time to change. It created a ton of resentment within Samsung. Just created a ton of incredible, just strange, just people were upset that he would be telling them this, that they need, they're successful. Why do they need to change? And then after this, the Samsung chairman, he gave out a series of gifts. Just to give you an example of the kind of rituals he would do to fire up his employees and shame them at the same time, gave out these phones and fax machines as gifts for Christmas in the mid-1990s, and then a lot of them were returned to him because they were faulty. So they were faulty, and of course he was really just angry about this because he saw that these Samsung executives weren't doing their job to improve the product. So he organized a bonfire. He actually got $50 million worth of phones, threw them into a giant pile, and then the Samsung employees had to cover them in patrol, and they threw a net over them. They put on bandanas that said, "Quality is my pride," and then they turned it into a tinderbox. They threw, they set it on fire, and then when the fire had consumed the remains, then a bulldozer came along, and a bulldozer destroyed the phones, and then destroyed the fax machines. And then the chairman told his employees that if you do this again, I'm going to come back and do the same thing. And some of the employees at this meeting just started crying. I mean, they were so shamed that their chairman, their emperor, could talk to them like this and could actually destroy their products, which was their baby. So this started, and I know we don't have a ton of time left, but I'm just trying to get through some of the, the major events that created this company. This really started the rejuvenation at Samsung, and this is what turned it into a global brand. Just a major global brand that has enormous respect in business circles, but also has this vexed, troubled generational succession issue that I could get to in a second. So the irony of all this is that the Samsung chairman now globalizes the company, and he's traveling around the world. He's hiring designers, marketers, especially from the U.S., bringing in a lot of Korean Americans, especially. They're doing all these high-profile product placements. They put one in the Matrix. They hire these designers who were, they had helped build the Watson Center at IBM, and they were involved in all kinds of prestigious design projects around the world. He truly tries to globalize this company. He also tried to acquire DreamWorks at some point. Walked into Steven Spielberg's home and told Steven Spielberg that he wanted control over Spielberg's movies. That did not actually fare well with Steven Spielberg, and Steven Spielberg rejected the Samsung chairman and told him to get out, basically, and said, "We don't want to work with you." But for the most part, despite that failure, Samsung does globalize, fails in some areas, fails in cars, but it does become a major global brand because of what the chairman had done and sort of what the people he had found had done for him. But the irony of all this is that as the Samsung chairman is instigating, his globalization and his rejuvenation among employees, he's also going in the background and starting this very troubled process of a generational succession. He made it clear that he wants his only son and his only son, Lee Jae-yong, to become the next chairman of Samsung. But the problem with Jay is that he's untested. He's not really, nobody really knows much about him. He started running a company called Samsung that had failed. It had failed miserably. The bubble had burst, and it was about $20 million in the hole, and it was shut down within a year. Nobody really knows what he's capable of, but the Samsung chairman starts this process of succession through these very shady and at times illegal, criminally illegal shareholding deals. Long story short, this starts in 1995 and 1996. There's a share sale that ends up benefiting the heirs to the Samsung empire. And two Samsung executives are actually investigated and sentenced to prison for the share sale, but they never served prison time. And this starts just a long sort of a never-ending process of this generational succession through these incredibly complex cross-shareholdings, this vast structure that really only exists at a major Korean conglomerate. And I wish that I could be in person actually for this, because I could show you on a slide just how complicated the Samsung structure is. I mean, it's more than 50 affiliates, and you look at it and it looks like a spaghetti bowl of companies that just own pieces of each other to this never-ending like circle of just companies that go around and around and around. And just Samsung Life Insurance owns a piece of Samsung Electronics. And the Samsung Everland would own a piece of Samsung Construction and Trading, and then the Samsung chairman Lee Byung-chul would have like 5% of Samsung Electronics, but he manages to control Samsung with such a minimal financial stake because of all these companies that own pieces of each other. This is a very troubled system. It doesn't guarantee a succession, and in fact, it's very difficult to pass the empire to his son through this system. So this creates a series of very, very complex and difficult and extremely shady, at times criminally negligent and illegal share sales over the next 20 years. I wish I could get more into how Samsung fought against Sony and Apple in these business wars, but I don't think we have time for that. But I will get to what happens at the end, which I'm sure many of you who lived in Korea are familiar with. If you saw those candlelight protests a few years ago when the president Park Geun-hye was brought down, impeached, and sentenced to 33 years in prison. She now rots in a prison cell for allowing this crony to control some of what she was doing without having any kind of security clearance. So what happens? I think what really gets the ball rolling on a lot of this major corruption scandal and this impeachment is that in 2015, Samsung, so Chairman Lee has a heart attack, and Samsung needs to get its heir Lee Jae-yong into the chairmanship. So it begins this very, very questionable this merger between Samsung C&T and Cheil, and gives Samsung C&T shareholders about a third of the value of the Cheil stock when this merger happens. So I won't get into all the mechanics of that because it's very I think it fries my brain every time I look at it. It's really just it's just like, wow. I mean, it's complicated share stuff. But long story short, this ignites a major battle from a New York hedge fund named Elliott Management. Elliott comes in. Elliott fights Samsung. Elliott says this is not acceptable because you're diverting value. They argue that Samsung is ripping off its shareholders. By the Samsung C&T shareholders are losing money because of this merger that's going. And what this merger is going to do is elevate Jay Lee into the chairmanship. Jay Lee is going to become the next chairman. It's going to raise his shareholding value. Elliott, which is run by a man named Paul Singer, is hit with an anti-Semitic media campaign in Korea over this. There are media reports going out in these business tabloids that say that Paul Singer is a Jew, literally, that Jews control the financial world, that Jews have interests in the U.S. government, that Korea is under attack from an international Jewish conspiracy. Samsung ends up publishing a cartoon on its website that shows this bird, which is presumably Paul Elliott Singer, who's the head of this hedge fund, a vulture with a giant beak going around the world and stealing money from little poor African children. The implication being that that Paul Singer is Jewish, and that he's this evil financier who's trying to pillage the hard work that Samsung has done. So just to give you an idea of the nationalism around this merger, despite it being controversial in Korea, it does lead to some very dramatic shareholding war. But in the end, Samsung wins. Samsung was able to muster up support. Samsung sent out all kinds of people to employees to serenade the shareholders, to give them all these, to give them like fruit baskets, and to give them, the walnuts and traditional Korean gifts, and just telling them that they really should support the merger. Puts on dozens of commercials, TV commercials, implores the Korean people to support Samsung because Samsung is Korea and Korea is the future of the nation. So it's just really an incredible just story where it's just like, in the end, Samsung wins. I mean, Samsung is victorious. Samsung is just comes out victorious. It later comes out that some Samsung executives have been bribing the Korean president and her crony with a series of payments and also horses that go to her crony's daughter. Truly one of the strangest stories I've ever seen in a democratic impeachment of a president. There's a religious leader, a cult leader who's now deceased, whose daughter has befriended the president. And then that woman, her daughter is a horseback rider. And they set up this very bizarre deal in which Samsung will buy horses. And then in exchange for that, there will be allegedly, not all the trials are finished yet, so I have to say allegedly. But in exchange for this, Samsung will get its merger in place, and it will fight off hedge funds like Elliott. So it's basically buy a horse, allegedly, and get a merger. And I find it fascinating how, when you're running a major company like this, something as small as a horse can become the major determining factor in what brings down the entire elite of an entire nation. So 5 Samsung executives, when this comes to light, they're arrested, they're put on trial. Jay Lee gets an unprecedented sentence of 5 years, serves 1 year of that, manages to stay on the Samsung board for the time being, manages to stay the vice chairman of Samsung, which is truly bizarre, I can only say. I've never heard of a publicly traded company keeping a convicted criminal on its board, for that long, and keeping him the vice chairman. Truly strange. But he serves a year. He's let off in this Korean tradition of going light on white-collar crime. He's let off. He goes to the appeal. Some of his bribery charge is held up. It is found that he did bribe people in power, but that it was passive bribing, that he was bullied. And then finally, this case goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules a mistrial and says that actually the lower courts should have considered, and this becomes, a debate over a horse. Like, is a horse a bribe, or is a horse just a payment, or is a horse just a gift? I mean, and by the way, what constitutes, like a horse? Like, why does a horse have to cost this much money, and why would Samsung buy a horse for somebody? I mean, it's just it just becomes like this very bizarre debate over in court over what is the meaning of the horse. And the court finally rules that 1 horse is not enough, that the lower court should have considered that 3 horses are actually bribes. And now the Samsung vice chairman awaits his final trial verdict, and awaits an end, either an end to the saga, either that he will return to the Samsung empire fully intact as a leader of the nation, that he will return to this Republic of Samsung, that he will lead the nation and its businesses in a way that has been done before, and he will be trusted in by future governments, or he will be brought down, he will be put back in prison, he will learn his lesson, he will be shamed before the nation, and he will see that a nation like Korea simply cannot tolerate the outsized power of these chaebol groups, and that even a man like the heir to the Samsung empire can be punished. It's still up in the air, and his verdict is due soon, probably when coronavirus is over. But I am watching very carefully, and I think it's one of the most interesting business corruption sagas ever. And I think it's going to determine a lot of the course of Korea for the years and maybe even decades to come. And thank you. That is all for today. And we'll go to questions.
All right, Jeff, thanks very much. I think there may be bazillion questions. If you folks will look on your, please keep your microphones muted. But on your screen in the menu somewhere, there should be a raise your hand icon. And on smartphones, it's maybe hidden in the additional or the more menu rather than obvious. Please check your mics again and mute them until you're called on. Thank you. Okay, Robert has a question. Go ahead, Robert.
I have a question and a comment. As you know, Chairman Lee has been in a coma for many years, and my understanding is that he's being kept alive in the hospital in part to prevent total disruption in this inheritance scheme and so forth, and all hell will probably break loose when he finally passes away. But my question is that still the case? Is he still hanging on there in the hospital? And my comment is, I met him once in the lobby of the Shilla Hotel, which is a Samsung hotel, and practice in Korea is to exchange business cards. And his business card contained one entry on it and one entry only, and that was his name, which reflects the ego of the man. You know, you've got to know who I am. I'm a big deal.
Yeah, incredible, incredible. Sounds about right. So, yeah, so the status of Lee Kun-hee and his hospitalization. So just to give some background for everybody here, in May 2014, he had a heart attack. And later, this has not been reported widely, but he had a stroke. Samsung has not come out publicly with that, but that's in the book. He had so he was put in a medically induced coma, and he woke up a few weeks later. Samsung claims that he woke up when the Samsung Lions baseball team was playing a game, and he was so excited that I guess he woke up or something. I kind of doubt that story. Sounds like something something a big company that loves its leader would put out, but whatever. So he's been in the hospital at one of the top floors of the Samsung Medical Center for the past 6 years, basically in a vegetative state. Samsung's very quiet about what his state has been. It's very sensitive at the company. People have told employees to not talk about the chairman's health. It's just, it's fascinating to me that he can still be the Samsung chairman on paper. He's still the chairman, and he's in a vegetative state, and he still manages to vote at shareholder meetings. I'm still trying to figure that one out. But it's Samsung. So anyway, so getting to your question, I have spoken to people who have been involved in the either in the treatment of the Samsung chairman, or kind of know what's going on because they're around those circles. Actually, I didn't get to publish a lot of that in the book because I was running, to be honest, I was running out of a word count, and I had to choose what to cut. So I decided not to gossip about the chairman's, is he dead or is he alive? Who knows? But they say that he's essentially on ice. I've heard from my sources at Samsung that he's a corpse, basically. That he's, that a few years ago he was able to move his eyes, but he was unable to speak. He's essentially incapacitated. I say this, I'm very careful about vetting this information and making sure that I'm getting it from people who know what's going on. But I think that, the reason they're doing this, the reason they're keeping him alive, is because of this. It's a $6 billion combined inheritance tax that's going to be split between Jay Lee and his two sisters, and most of it will go to Jay Lee. So Korea has one of the highest inheritance taxes in the world. It's about 50%, I believe, at the highest bracket. It might have changed. And then on top of that, under Korean law, until recently, it might have changed now. There was a law that if he were to die and the inheritance were to happen, the mother, so Hong Ra-hee, who's his wife, would get a 1.5 ratio of his shares and assets to a 1 ratio split among the 3 kids, which is an imbalance to them. Huge imbalance. I mean, that basically could give her control of the company. And that could weaken Jay Lee's position. So really, this is all about getting Jay Lee onto his throne. And if he's unable to get to that throne, that's gonna ruin more than 20 years of work that Samsung executives have been doing to with all these complicated share sales and swaps and mergers and all these acquisitions. It's just going to dislodge him, and they feel it's going to dislodge the company and its identity. So yeah, I mean, I personally find it a little bit hilarious that they're keeping him alive this long. I mean, it just seems kind of I mean, I feel bad for him. It's never I don't want to laugh at somebody who had a heart attack. That's not good. But it's I mean, just writing this book and watching events unfold, it's almost like I just got such a kick out of how ridiculous this kept getting. Like I mean, when rumors would go around that he died, and these rumors were published in some Korean tabloids, the stock of Samsung ironically went up, which might tell you about the confidence of shareholders in Samsung's governance right now. I don't think shareholders are very happy that they have a chairman who's rumored to be a corpse. And I think that maybe they secretly think that his death might be the way forward, because there will be more certainty over the future leadership of the company, and there's not going to be this whole Jay Lee question hanging over everybody. So yeah, but that's where it stands now, and I mean, I think that they have a few more chess moves to make before he does end up dying finally.
Let's go to Tom Coiner for a question. And then after Tom, we'll go to Russell Kelly. Tom, go ahead.
Hi, great. All right. Hi. I assume you can hear me. But I spent about 25 years in the Pacific Rim dealing with Japanese and Korean companies. And one of the common denominators when they went international is often, for example, they would go in the U.S. market and soon realized to be successful in the U.S. they would have to hire top American talent. But there was always a revolving door, because they bring in these really qualified individuals who were routinely overridden arbitrarily by senior executives, not necessarily of the T family or Hu family and LG or whatever. And so it was frustrating, and they left. Now, I've been away from the game a while, so has Samsung been able to have a more open-minded approach about listening to advice from qualified foreign executives in doing their business abroad, as well as maybe even domestically?
Yes, thank you, Tom. That's a really good question, and I appreciate that one, actually. So this is actually, for any of you who do want to end up buying the book, I have quite a long stretch of stories about exactly this problem, and I'm just going to hold it up. If you guys do want to read more in detail about this, it starts at this chapter called Guardians of the Galaxy, and this is about the Apple versus Samsung smartphone wars and how Samsung handled that. So just to illustrate my answer, I'll just give you an anecdote here. So when Samsung realized it had an Apple problem and it had to somehow hold off the Apple onslaught and then hopefully beat Apple one day, they realized that a lot of their talent had to come from outside Korea, that they were going to have to expand, especially in America, in Silicon Valley, New York, places where there were large amounts of software talent, marketing talent, designers, people who were more on the softer side of the business. One of the things that Samsung wanted to do was essentially, you could say, pull an Apple. They wanted to go beyond being a hardware manufacturer, focus on the engineering of a phone and just telling people about the hardware features and why the hardware is great, to actually creating an experience, as they would call it in the tech industry. Like Apple, you pick up an iPhone and it's not the phone that you're really just admiring or looking at. When you buy an iPhone, back then you were buying the whole experience. You would go into the Apple store, somebody would help you. It's seamless. You would buy the iPhone. It would have a very nice fluid design. And then not only that, but the software would be designed to work very well, and it would kind of flow nicely with the hardware. I mean, it would be matched up. You could download your music on the iTunes back in the day with the iPod. I mean, Apple had really mastered the whole process from the sale of the product, from the design and the sale and the distribution to the end, the user experience, whereas Samsung was still essentially a hardware maker. So Samsung opened a new center in San Jose, California, where all the action is. They went out, they poached up lots of software developers, people who could try to create their own operating system called Tizen. They hired a group of marketers from Nike who would work out of Texas, which was their big marketing and sales office in America. This was really I would say that in its history, this was probably one of the high points of this company and, its efforts to be this global firm. So one of the names of these marketers, his name was Todd Pendleton, and he was the chief marketing officer for Samsung Telecommunications America, which sold phones in the U.S. And he came in from Nike. He had a really interesting background. He had worked with the NBA. He was signing, LeBron James. He was, one of these sports marketers who, knew how to sell a shoe, and most importantly, knew the importance of cultural marketing. Knew how to kind of insert a brand into a cultural moment, as you would call it. So there's Just Do It with Nike, and back then Just Do It was really cool, and people really respected Nike, and they didn't see that swoosh, and they didn't think, like some people would think sweatshops, and some people would think unethical practices, but a lot of people would look at it and they would think like, I want, I'm willing to pay $200 for my new Nike shoes, whereas I'm willing to pay $80 for my Adidas shoes or my Reebok shoes, because they just don't have the same brand power. So he wanted to do the same thing with Samsung, to elevate the brand power, to elevate kind of the name and the respect and sort of the cultural power of Samsung on a level with Apple, so that Samsung would basically be the only company mentioned in the same breath as Apple. Back then, people would say, well, you're getting a smartphone, so therefore you're getting an iPhone. But after Todd Pendleton came, it changed. He was able to flip the narrative, and then people would say like, well, are you going to get an Apple or a Samsung? I mean, he was the guy who was able to create that change through a very good marketing campaign. So this marketing campaign went on for about 2 or 3 years. One of the high points was when they were able to plant a Samsung phone in the Oscars with Ellen DeGeneres, and they used that to take this Oscars selfie that was a big deal in the 2014 Oscars. But the Korean headquarters didn't like what he was doing. And the reason was because, first of all, he was too errant. He was running too far from the core Samsung marketing efforts that came out of Korea. And that basically made them look bad. I mean, this guy was going out doing his own thing, and then the Korean bosses, the top executives, would be like, well, like he did his own thing, and now he's doing better than us. And every office around the world is just itching to adopt this campaign, which was called The Next Big Thing Is Here. And then the other problem was that he actually went head-to-head with Apple. He would release commercials that just made fun of Apple. And this was a problem because the Samsung semiconductor offices and the display offices who supplied Apple for its iPhones and iPad, they had a partnership with Apple. They couldn't, they couldn't stand a Samsung marketer just making fun of Apple or berating them in these commercials and making fun of their customers too. So this actually ended in it ended in a series of very punishing audits. The marketers on Todd Pendleton's team in Texas were forced to go through their books to prove that they were not corrupt, to prove that they were not bribing the media, to prove that they were not doing all these ridiculous, things that it's like, I mean, come on, they were accused of bribing the media at one point. There was one meeting they had with a Korean executive who doubted their numbers because apparently they had to audit an office in Russia, and they found that the Russian office was cooking the books a bit. So therefore, the office in Texas was suspect too, that they might have been cooking the books and playing up their successes. And it just ended with these audits and these punishing conference calls and lots of yelling from the headquarters. And finally, Samsung released a campaign called One Samsung. And the goal, it was an internal marketing campaign, internal PR campaign to unify the Samsung brand back under the headquarters and back under a single vision. So Todd Pendleton's team got chased out. It was, the marketers were exhausted, and these were top marketers. They felt that they were being punished for their hard work. Todd Pendleton left in the end because he was a bit disappointed that Samsung was pulling back from marketing and pulling back from software, pulling back from some of these newer areas. And the end result was that Samsung, ironically, under Jay Lee, went back to its traditions in many ways. It had gone back to being a hardware maker that was being run by engineers, and the products were the focus. And any effort to release software just wasn't really going that far. A lot of the software efforts had been shut down. Tizen, the OS, they had been playing that up for a while, but it still hasn't caught on. It's very buggy. It has a lot of issues. There was a program called Milk Music and Milk Video, and it was an effort to make an iTunes or a Spotify service for Samsung. It was very popular for a while internally. People loved the user interface. But ultimately, the hardware engineers who lead the company came in and said, we're going to do it this way. And we can't have all these offices overseas in America or in Europe or India calling the shots and getting control over this unified Samsung umbrella. I think it's a very uniquely kind of chaebol problem and conglomerate problem that, they're making all these hardware products, and a lot of times they can't go head to head with a competitor because, they're stuck. I mean, we have to supply Apple, but we also have to work with Apple. So.
Okay, we'll go to Russell Kelly, and then after Russell, Jacko Svetso has a question for us.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Steve, and thanks, Geoffrey. That's a pretty interesting talk. Yeah, I've got a question. In 2013, I was lucky enough to become a mature age exchange student at Korea University, and I quickly learned that a lot of the students there aspired to join the big corporation of Samsung. And Samsung had a lot to do with Korea University. There's a magnificent hall there, Samsung Hall. And I've since learned also that they have a heavy influence at Seoul National. And they use these universities to recruit from. So I guess in a nutshell, my question is, to what extent does Samsung own these universities?
Yes. So the influence over universities?
Yes.
So, yes. So I'm sure a lot of you in Korea know that Sungkyunkwan University is basically, it was bought by Samsung a long time ago. And, they have the Samsung library there. They've hired a lot of ex-Samsung type people to be professors. I don't think Samsung outright controls it, but Samsung definitely controls the foundation that controls the university. But so yes, getting to your point, Lee Byung-chul, back when he founded Samsung, he knew that being able to control education was one of the ways, from a business standpoint, in the long run, it was one of the ways to create these loyal Samsung men, these loyal employees. And this is a tradition. I mean, the Samsung man, I should clarify, it's a dying tradition. It's not as big as it used to be, but it used to be in the 1950s to say the 1990s. This idea of sort of like Mad Men, the guy in the nice suit who comes into the office and drinks a good whiskey and has a cigar. And then, on the after work, all the company men go out together and have barbecue. And it's the idea of, company as family and family as company. And Lee Byung-chul knew that, being able to mold a Samsung man and being able to mold an ideal employee who, had that talent or that, that human resources focused approach that he liked, really depended on education. And he knew that if he could control education, he could bring in more successful employees who would work for Samsung for a long time. One of his first purchases when the American military government showed up before the Korean War, was to purchase a university in, I believe it was in Daegu. And I forgot, it was a small university. I don't know if it exists today, but that was one of his first targets. It was that and a local newspaper. And this was before he went to Seoul and before he became, a major tycoon. But, once he got to Seoul, he expanded his sites, and then he bought Sinkyunkwan University. And Samsung has also, through its foundation, they set up a number of scholarships. So like today, there's the Lee Byung-chul Scholarship, named after the Samsung chairman. And traditionally, the purpose of a lot of this, like obviously a scholarship helps, but a lot of the purpose was to find talent, to select them to be some kind of future potential Samsung employee. And occasionally the purpose would be to put them on a fast track. Like, we found the talent young, and we're going to put them on a fast track. They're going to get promoted faster than other executives because they're talented and we spotted intelligence, but also they're going to be loyal to us. There was an expectation. I've heard this from a lot of, prosecutors in Korea in past decades, not so much recently, but if you were a recipient of the Samsung scholarship, there was kind of an expectation that, you owed something to Samsung, and you were a part of the club, and you had to look out for them as much as you could. I think that is a dying tradition now with the, the recent corruption scandals. I don't think that Samsung has as much influence as it used to, but it still does have influence. A lot of graduates still want to work there, and it still is, something that a lot of people look up to.
Thanks very much. Jacko, go ahead with your question.
Hello, can I be heard now? Geoffrey, great to see you there in Chicago. Sorry we missed each other in Leiden last year in October. Anyway, great to see you, and nice to have the book out finally. My question is about the different spin-offs, subsidiaries, and other firms. I think you've mentioned Shinsegae earlier today. We've got Cheil, Sehan, and other ones. What are the reasons why these different spin-offs came out of Samsung, and has Samsung tried to buy any of them back over the years?
Mm-hmm. So you mean the spin-offs? So when you talk about Cheil, Cheil acquired Samsung C&T. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, them, but also I think is it the Sehan is another.
Oh yeah.
And also Renault Samsung, which of course was bought out by Renault. Some other ones, and Shinsegae. So I'm just wondering, like, to what extent are they still involved, or are they completely separate from? Are there any that are completely separate from Samsung Group these days, or are they still somehow interrelated?
So okay, yeah. So good question. So these spin-offs. So just to give you all some background, the original Samsung empire, when Lee Byung-chul died, it was spun off into 5 companies, and those were Samsung Electronics, which is controlled by the current chairman. And then there is CJ, Cheil Jae-dong, which does films. They did Parasite recently. There was Sehan, which made VCRs and I think made chemicals for a little while. There was Hansol, which makes paper. They also do chemicals. And there was Shinsegae, which is the department store. So when Lee Byung-chul died, there was actually no, and this is a chaebol tradition, like there wasn't really a paper will. It wasn't totally clear in writing who really got what, even though these companies were separated for each sibling. But the problem was that they still had all these cross-ownership interests. They had lots of these cross-shareholdings between these companies. And so, a lot of them, excuse me, a lot of them wanted these siblings wanted to break off and wanted to do their own thing. They didn't want to be beholden, like the CJ people didn't want to be beholden to Samsung chairman Lee Kun-hee. They wanted, so Lee Myung, who's the chairman of CJ, wanted to go off and do her own thing, and she wanted to make movies. So this actually happened in the 90s. So there was a series of share swaps and sales, and they all spun off each other into different areas. I mean, so now they're all kind of involved in different businesses. CJ was probably the second most successful behind Samsung Electronics. I mean, I think they've done a lot for the Korean wave and Korean cinema music. I mean, they've done a lot with K-pop, and that's because they have a patron who really cares about, cares about that kind of thing, cares about culture, cares about music. So there haven't really been many efforts by Samsung to buy up these companies again. I mean, I think that the territory has hardened, and it's clear. It's clear now who controls what, and it's clear what's valuable and what's not. So Jay Lee has gone through a process of spinning off some firms that haven't been very profitable in recent years. So there was the Samsung TechWin. I think that was sold to Hanwha, and they used to make engines, airplane engines and components and car engines and that kind of thing. And you did mention Samsung Motors and the sale to Renault. That happened after the IMF crisis, the economic crisis of '97. So I think that one's a little bit different because Samsung was forced to sell it, essentially. It had no choice because it was so far in the red, and there was government pressure. And then on top of that, the Samsung chairman, he really wanted to make cars, and to see his own car company get destroyed by the financial crisis was just devastating to him and devastating to Samsung employees. I think that's the only one I've heard where there's been some nostalgia, where the older executives look back. I actually met with a Samsung executive a couple of years ago who had done a tour of Tesla and looked at, their cars and their factory lines. And the executives who went were talking with each other, and they were saying, like, could you just imagine if Samsung Motors had succeeded and we had managed to, create this technology ecosystem that includes smartphones and, software and, includes all the gadgets, the semiconductors, the components. We can make the engine with TechWin. Like, imagine if Samsung had all the makings of a car, or a self-driving car, or an electric car, or a new car that's going to start to define the market in the coming years. Like, imagine how much of a juggernaut, even more than today, Samsung would be. So, I mean, I don't think that Samsung has made an effort to buy up Renault Motors again. I mean, the Samsung Renault Motors. I'm not totally sure about that, though. I haven't heard of it, though. But I do know that there is nostalgia and there's some resentment that, Samsung, the chairman couldn't get everything he wanted. I mean, he had these big visions, but he also failed a lot. And, I think we tend to, when looking at Korean history, it's easy to forget all the failures of these chaebol leaders. I mean, it's easy to hold them up as some kind of grand success, which is really common in the company materials. But they did fail a lot, and they did lose a lot of really valuable companies. And, they could have done different things that I think would make the companies more valuable today. But that's all in hindsight. I mean, that's something that anybody can look at back on and say you could have done better.
Great. Well, thank you all for your questions. Jeff, thank you so much for getting up early and joining us here. Same for some of the others of you in the U.S. who got up early. There's a few of you I noticed coming in. Appreciate you being patient with me as we deal with this new medium, and hope to see you in a couple of weeks at our next lecture, which will probably be by Zoom. We'll let you know as soon as we get that pinned down with our speaker. So a good night to those of you on this side of the world. A good day to the rest of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Steve.